Or good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome. First and foremost, let me welcome those that are joining us virtually this morning. Thank you for joining us for our panel discussion on women in leadership, what it takes to cultivate leadership in an inclusive workplace culture. This is a part of our Tisch Inclusive Leadership Institute that we've been doing with Tisch Leadership and Management under the direction of Dean Dana Cunningham. So it's really, really great to be here today with all of you. My name is Monroe France, and I am the Vice Provost for Institutional Inclusive Excellence, and as well Professor of the Practice here at Tisch. So really wonderful to be in conversation today. Before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land in which that we're all seated on or occupying in this moment. This is the indigenous land of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket and their neighbors, and the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land for centuries, over 400 centuries, as a matter of fact. And today, we're seated and occupying this land. And so as we're here together collectively, I would just like to remind us of that, and as well to acknowledge the labor of those that have put the tables together, put our tablecloths on our tables, prepared our food, and made it possible for us to be here in community together, along with those that have made it possible for those of us who are joining via technology to be a part of today's conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And finally, the labor for centuries that have gone unrecognized and unacknowledged. Why don't we just take a moment and pause to honor the land, the people, and nature. Thank you. And today's conversation is, in part, our opportunity to acknowledge Women's History Month. In addition to today's conversation this morning, we also have an event this evening at 6 p.m. Where we'll be in conversation with Raquel Willis, who is a trans activist who has done incredible work in the liberation of women of color and trans people here in the United States and more broadly. Please do join us for that. There is still opportunity to RSVP, to attend virtually, or to join in person. If you check our website, the Office of Institutional Inclusive Excellence, you can find more details there. So now let's get to today's conversation, which I'm incredibly excited about with our invited guests. So we have with us today Dr. Lisa Coleman, who is New York University's inaugural Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation. She's also a faculty member in the Stern School of Business, along with NYU Upper W, and does many other things in the world, and also happens to be my former boss when I was at NYU. So it's really lovely to have Lisa back here at Tufts. It's another part of her journey. She worked at Tufts at one point before going on to Harvard. And so welcome, Dr. Coleman. Welcome, Lisa. And then in addition, we have Elaine Ng, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Third Sector New England, which is also known as TSNE. She has over 30 years of leadership experience in the nonprofit and education sectors, and also is a deep partner here to Tisch. It works very closely with Tisch in some of our community-based work, and also has sit on numerous panels here at the university in the past. So Elaine, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning as well. I will say, unfortunately, Dr. Denise Bates could not be with us here today. She has fallen ill, and she sends her regrets that she could not be a part of today's conversation. So, Denise, if you're happy to be watching virtually, please get better soon. Thank you, thank you, thank you for making a commitment, and we'll get you next time to join us. So we want to get started with today's conversation. We have about 25 minutes or so of questions that I will be in conversation with Elaine and Lisa. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions both here in the room, because there are folks here in the room, and then those who are joining us virtually, we'll have a way for you to submit questions through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen in your Zoom app or your Zoom profile. And so if you have questions for the panelists, please do submit those there, and my colleagues will be facilitating that when we get to the question and answer part for today. So I want to dive right in a conversation about inclusive leadership. And we often talk about it being a core value to both how we think about individual leadership and collective leadership and collective success within organizations, and that it should be embedded in all activities that we do, or in also our organizational priorities. So I would love to hear both Elaine and Lisa a bit about your own career journeys and whether or not you consider yourself an inclusive leader. I know that part is probably aha question, what? But you know, I am curious how you think about that, and how do you know you're an inclusive leader? So we'll start with you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. It's lovely to be back at Tufts. And so, yes, I consider myself an inclusive leader. You can ask other folks, I guess, you know, we'll see what they have to say. I have those 360s sometimes, so, you know. But how do I know? And then I'll come back to the journey part. I think how I know is that collaboration is really important to me. So if we think about those 6 C's of inclusive leadership, and what I can witness, because we all have the spots that we can't see, but what I can witness is that I can do it across generations, right? I can work with Gen Z and the alphas, and I can work with the silent generation. That was my mom, who was 91 years old, who was not silent. Okay, that woman was not silent at all. So, right, and so being able to work across generations, right, is very important today, because working across generations is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, and people don't agree. So I think about how you have to have that kind of adaptability, fluidity across multiple dynamic, right, kinds of generations, personalities, perspectives, and different ways of even thinking about how the world operates. Digital natives, digital technology, all of those kinds of things. And then we can just think about culture, right? You said in my introduction, I teach in Abu Dhabi, and I do, which is one of the most diverse regions in the world, right? Bringing together all these different cultures. And so then thinking about the difference between someone who's coming from Turkey and someone who's coming from Colombia, right? That's very different. And how they think about nation, let alone, right, how they might think about things like gender, et cetera. So I try to get feedback, constant feedback. As you know, sometimes my teams are not as excited about that constant feedback as I am. But I do try to make sure I'm getting constant feedback all the time. Okay, journey, quick journey. Which I think is how I hopefully have become more inclusive over time, is I started off in the sciences and was very interested in sort of scientific exploration. I think that background allowed me to be explorative, right, to explore different kinds of things. That exploration then led me out of the sciences into some other areas, and then into the diversity, equity, and inclusion field eventually. And you said inaugural in my introduction. I've had like 4 inaugural jobs. What that really means is I'm old, like really old. And so I've been at it a long time, and I started when there were no diversity officers, right? So I started as a pioneer in a kind of way in this field. So in that way, I do feel akin to some entrepreneurs. I've also had multiple inaugural roles. So in that way, I also feel like a startup often, right? I'm starting something up and then moving. And so in that way, that kind of journey in most of my positions in the DEI space have been in that realm. I quickly, when I left the sciences, went into philanthropy, and I worked for now a company that has been bought by another company. I worked for them for a long time, for a little bit, and I understood something about research and fundraising and those kinds of things. So science, research, and fundraising, DEI, I did a little stint in the humanities and film, and like all of that together, what I like to say is that journey allowed lots of skill transfer and lots of skill development across also, and this is where I'll end my comments, a trans and interdisciplinary approach that has allowed me then to also think about those intersections across disciplines and fields, which is also then relevant to the first part of that question, which is about inclusive leadership.
Thank you. Have you respond to the same question?
I think I will echo and double down on a lot of what Lisa has shared. So first, my answer is yes. And for just for background in the journey piece, I feel like, yeah, I come out of youth development. That was kind of my first real job after a stint at a bank after college, which, you know, something way in the past. But I started off working in community youth development and community-based center in my neighborhood of Chinatown in Boston, is where I grew up. And back then, there was no DEI. You know, it started off as cultural access. I think for people who started work in the late 80s, 90s, it was cultural access. And then it was cultural competence, and then cultural proficiency, and then we moved into DEI, and
So many words.
so many words that really don't mean anything when you think about it, right? And so my journey in DEIJ and DEIB, we actually say DEIB in my workplace: diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the belonging for us is kind of the ultimate sense of inclusion at its fullest, that you actually belong and you can claim ownership over things that you may not have had access to, or people barred access for you. And the evolution of the journey for me has been always with people, because I come out of youth development. I've always worked with people, and in particular young people, and in education, and the adversities that people in community face day to day was the everyday of my life and my work. And the progression of how institutions, educational institutions, public institutions, private institutions, nonprofits, support people on that journey. It's kind of the foundation of my thinking on how to make change. In terms of like inclusive leadership, I'm a firm believer of it. I try and practice it, but like Lisa, I think, the proof is in the pudding and is in your 360 reviews, right? And it's in the feedback that you get from the folks that you work with, because you can believe that you're inclusive and think that your actions are inclusive, but if the people that you're trying to support and develop do not feel that way, that's food for thought. So having that feedback, and particularly having critical feedback, is hard. It's really hard for anybody to get critical feedback, but it's important that we all do, so that we can actually learn and develop ourselves and move forward with that feedback, especially in areas of DEIJ or DEIB. You may believe, we all, I think, would like to believe that we are acting in ways that are mentoring and developing and supportive of others, but it may not be, or may not be perceived that way, and you may be patronizing, or some other unintended consequence could come from that. So having that feedback, I think, is really critical, and is actually that type of feedback that's helped me become the person that I am. And also, my children are very free to give me feedback. Never welcome by me, but has also helped shape who I am. And I think soliciting that and really taking it seriously is really important to shaping your perspective as a leader. And it's also a check to make sure that you're acting in ways that are appropriately supporting people and appropriately developing people.
Thank you. So this piece about feedback, I heard that thread through both of what you both said. And then this, like, when you said your children give you feedback, they're the most critical, right? They're real. And so that generational feedback, too, when you think of all across the generations. And so we're, in a very dynamic time right now in the workplace where, we're navigating employees wanting to have more agency and more voice. We're navigating, like, shifts towards, do we go fully in person, hybrid? What does hybrid mean? I mean, we use that word, but it means so many different things across contexts, and people interpret it in many different ways. And then, of course, right, people are working longer, right? And so we think about, like, really, truly, now we have to think about generational diversity in real critical ways, and then shifts and emerging shifts in industries when we think about technology, AI, and just how we work, right, globally and here in the United States. So as you think about many workplace changes that are developing and emerging, and you all have been in different fields as well. So as you think about those workplace changes that we see, what are ones that are really salient to you, especially in this space as we think about, like, creating more belonging and inclusion in the workplace? And what values or skills do you think leaders need to be responsive to these shifts? Elaine, we'll start with you first.
Okay. So, what comes to mind immediately for me is the generational differences in the workplace right now. There are, in most workplaces, 4 generations now, and in some 5. And there are significant generational differences in their approach to work, both in work ethic, but also in work styles and expectations of employers. And navigating that, I think, is one of the hardest things that we do. My organization has 400 plus employees, and we have 5 generations in the workplace right now. And working with a millennial versus working with, most times semi-retired 80-year-old who is, contributing. They're very different perspectives that they bring to the work, and yet they, have their own value, right? Each one has different values and are different stages of their own learning journeys. So as an employer, how do you support both ends of that spectrum is really challenging. And, in particular, I find that, the millennials in the workspace are really hard for me to, I'm a young baby boomer, so old Gen X, the distance in technology is huge. I'm a Luddite compared to, a lot of the millennials in the workforce. And because of the hybridization of work, technology is paramount, right, in our functionality. And the adeptness at utilizing technology is very important now for a lot of workplaces. And when you think about inclusivity, how do you think about access to technology? Or how do you decrease the use of technology only in instances where it's necessary so that you're not locking out folks who are less comfortable with utilizing technology? I think those are questions that didn't exist in the workplace 5, 6 years ago, when most things were in person. And it's something that I think a lot of employers don't pay enough attention to, and then de facto lock out the older generations from contributing back to society or to the workplace. So, I think when we think about generational differences, we tend to lock out older generations and we focus on inclusivity for the younger folks. Right. But they're still active and vibrant part of our workforce, so how do we think about that, plus technology? AI and, access to AI and utilization of AI is, in my opinion, somewhat meaningless if you can't effectively include the people behind the implementation of whatever AI provides you. If it's a communications function and you have AI creating scripts or newsletters for you, who are the people who can actually talk about it, and actually champion it to your constituencies or to your students? So I think there's lots of open questions.
Thank you. And I think that's an interesting part. Not only how do we include, but how do we facilitate engagement across the generations too, right? And so it's an interesting dynamic we're having to navigate more as leaders and managers in the differing expectations. So Lisa, I want you to follow up on that question as well. What trends are you seeing, and what competencies do we need to be responsive? Yeah.
So the trends, and I'll just piggyback on my colleagues' comments, are that certainly the AI, we see ChatGPT, we see all of these things entering, and then, of course, into the higher education spaces. And I think that the point about humans and who's behind and how those productions are happening, and then your other points about disparities and inequities across digital access. right? And so I think that we have to be attentive to those things, which leads me to the first point I want to make, which are about partnerships. And so I think partnerships are one way to develop and create greater access, whether that's partnerships with community organizations and higher education and industry, governmental partnerships. And I think when we think about the sustainability of DEI, justice, belonging work, then it's related to those partnerships, right? Those partnerships are where we see that. And that can be helpful for faculty and research, NIH, NSF, and National Endowment for the Humanities, right? Staff, collaborations, et cetera. So I think there are all kinds of opportunities, and when you think about, I'm on a governmental task force right now, it's about cybersecurity, and thinking about diversification in cybersecurity, right? And partnering with higher education institutions and community organizations, right? So I think the input is important because the output is then, will be, as you've just said. So I think partnerships can help us navigate that intentionality, et cetera. These comments about cross generations, I think generational work must be deep and intentional, to go back to your earlier points. We don't like each other. And I hear it all the time. So people will say things like, those alphas or those Gen Z, I just wish they would, blah, blah. Those boomers, those, Xers, could they just get out of the way? Right, and so I think that I hear a lot of comments, a lot of bias. I do a lot of leadership workshops, et cetera, and with CEOs of companies and et cetera. So I hear a lot of things. And I think that we have to figure out, right, and I'll give you a very concrete example. I teach in the Stern School of Business. And so the students are millennials, most of them, all right? And I just had a conversation with them, and they were like this. What is wrong with these alphas and this Gen Z? I mean, they just can't seem to get it together. And I was like, you know that they said that about you, right, 5 minutes ago, right? And they said it about the other generations 5 minutes ago. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I think we have to, remember that our generations, I can remember what he's even said about my generation, but I also think this intentional work that we need to do together. So I'm fascinated by this organization out of Arizona called Teen Years. And it's teenagers teaching older people, more seasoned people, how to use technology. And the older people are being taught, are helping the younger people write things like cover letters, right? And actually use AI, but actually with their own input, right? So I'm interested in these kinds of, again, partnerships where people can come together across generations. Home Depot is starting to hire people who are older in the retired workforce, right? We see SAP doing work with people on the autism and Asperger's spectrums. And so I think that there is great work out there that we can really begin to think about generationally. What we know is that people will have disabilities, right? As you age, you get some, as you're younger, et cetera. And so how would we tap into those workforces, for instance, right? And so I think those are the kinds of things that can bring us together across generations. The last thing I'll say about this is the skills and traits. That's what you're the one embedded in your question. And I think that the skills and traits, one of the skills, so I talked about collaboration before, but I think courage is the other skill. Courage is hard. It's hard to be courageous. It's hard to know when to be courageous. And it's also hard to risk, right, and take strategic risks. And so I think to figure out, and sometimes we can figure that out across generations, right? I don't want to be canceled. I have been, but I don't want to be canceled, okay? And so I think thinking about, right, what do those risks look like across generations? How do you work with risk? And so I think courage is something that we have to like lean into a little bit and then figure out what that looks like. And some of that goes back to the courage to get feedback, right? And to take that feedback and to hear that feedback and not just to write it off as, oh, well, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, et cetera. So, and I work in a global community with 80,000 people, as you know. And so getting feedback is critical because if I don't get feedback, there are things I just don't know, right? I've never lived in South Africa. I don't know that culture, and I can't pretend that I do. And so I have to get feedback constantly about what I'm doing, how am I doing it, and then to go back to this, have the courage to be collaborative, and in those collaborations have reciprocity, so that those partnerships are not just unidirectional, but they are actually beneficial to both entities.
So, yeah, go ahead, Elaine.
Can,
think you
I
follow
just
up,
want to
please.
add a skill to that, because that reminds me that in addition to courage, I think it's also important to have humility. You know, because without humility, you're not going to approach people in the ways that you just illustrated, Lisa. So,
Elaine, can you say more? Because we often hear people use this buzz phrase of humility. You must have humility. What does that mean, though? What does it look like?
so I thought of it,
Yeah.
you know, as being part of what Lisa illustrated, because if you have humility, you have the courage to be open to feedback, right? You have the ability to take it in and work with it, because you have an understanding that you don't know what you don't know, right? Which is also something that Lisa said. So, you know, for me, I think of humility as all of those things wrapped into one, you know, and understanding that we are always learners, and that we have to have respect for the fact that we don't know everything. So, you know, and then have the courage to admit that, and not just to yourself, but to others around you, because, you know, I feel like that's a really strong trait of a great leader, is somebody who can admit that they're wrong and that they don't know it all, and they can work and improve.
Can I just add one thing? Because this idea of mistakes, right, and being able to recover from mistakes and actually admit those mistakes in public, which we don't see a lot of our leaders often doing, I think is so critical to empathy and courage and humility. And empathy is key. We hear, that's another buzzword we hear. And empathy is about listening. Right, it's about leaning in and listening and have the courage to do so. And that piece about humility, I cannot thank you, because it's so important. And I think these buzzwords, unless we know how we're leaning in, what do those things mean? And empathy is about design thinking as a model that you cannot have the model of design thinking without starting with empathy.
Yep.
Because you can't create a product with other people without listening and getting all the feedback, right, to get to the ideation stage, let alone the prototype and the testing phase. So even in the sort of entrepreneurial, science, et cetera, methodologies, you have to start with empathy, let alone inclusive leadership, et cetera, right? So thinking about that and starting from that grounding point allows that humility and also brings in a certain kind of courage.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of design thinking, so thank you for bringing that up. And there's been a lot of criticism recently about design thinking and the failure of design thinking. But my belief is that, you know, it's failing because people actually don't approach it with true empathy. That's right. That it's, you know, it's not true. It's just performative empathy, right? And then if you approach design thinking without true empathy, you're not going to have great results, because yes, exactly. So.
Well, and so, I mean, you all are demonstrating something to me that, you know, I think has shifted the way we think about work, and it's being women in leadership. And so in the spirit of Women's History Month, right, I need the mic. Lisa?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, Elaine, thank you. Sorry, I'm getting cues those on social media, on Zoom, so I was following those cues. Okay, thank you. So women in leadership, I think, have shifted the way we think about work. And then at the intersections of that, women of color in leadership. And I'm very clear that for me, you know, women of color, Black women in particular, are my North Star. And so when you think about like shifts in how we lead and how we think about the workplace, how have women, and in particular women of color, helped to make those shifts?
I'm starting this time. Okay. So when I think about women in leadership, the first thing I think about is COVID. And all the countries that were guided through COVID and were very successful were led by women. Taiwan, Germany, and New Zealand. Let me take New Zealand for an example just quickly with Jacinda Ardern. right? And so we saw Jacinda Ardern lead that country through two major crises, right? A gun crisis and then the COVID crisis. And what we also saw was the way she was treated during that and then during the time that she stepped down. So I think we have a kind of all-time high in some ways with women in leadership. We see women represented in leadership in very unique ways that we haven't seen historically, from prime minister positions to other kinds of legislative positions, CEOs of companies. We can talk about the Fortune 500. They're still working it out. But even in the Ivy League institutions, right, we've seen women lead. Okay, we can talk about what happened. All right, so now let's talk about can't let it go, right? Can't leave it on the table. So and now we've also seen what has happened. So I said this a few years ago, when I started to see the legislative attacks against women. So whatever your perspective is on Roe v. Wade, right? I'm not trying to have a political conversation about Roe v. Wade and whether you're for or against, right, the abortion. What I'm trying to talk about is the kind of proliferation of propaganda that surrounded that, okay? And then I saw that. Then I saw what was happening with the attacks on some of the people running for office in gubernatorial races, et cetera. And then we saw, of course, some of the attacks on prime ministers. And at the same time, right, and this is like a few years ago, we started to hear these terms, black girl magic. And I was like, oh, I love it, but I know the downside. And so at the same turn, right, I saw all these things happening, and then I saw, right, the attacks. And first globally legislative, and then we see, right, what happens with, let's say, some of the presidents of universities, et cetera. And so what I think is it is an all-out warfare against women and girls. And it is coming in all forms. It is unrelenting. And it is often unnamed in certain kinds of ways. And I see it with girls in particular with mental health crises with girls, which is on the rise. And so if you talk to psychiatrists and and pediatricians who work with young girls, what they're seeing are heightened crises at younger ages, right? And so these kinds of things are concerning. Assaults in schools, right? All kinds of things that are happening. And those things, I think, have gone underground in a certain kind of way, in this idea of liberation. And the fact that we have representational, that we can identify women leaders. And so I am very, very committed to how do we create, to go back to some of the language used earlier, belonging cultures where women and girls are able to thrive and not just survive. And then I'll answer the second part, which is about women of color. So if we look at women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women who are from marginalized communities, Hmong communities, et cetera, particularly in the United States, but globally as well, Taiwanese. If we look at Latinx communities and from particular countries in terms of migration and refugee populations, what we know is that though the rates of things like Black women in the United States, their rates of maternal health, right, and infant mortality are greater than a lot of our third world countries, right? So we have like a lot of work to do in terms of justice, equity, equitable systems. And so my work is really to look at those systems and to really work with partners who are trying to think about how do we elevate those systems. Now, lastly, what I'll say, women in leadership are doing a great job. Many, many women are doing a great job, and some of that has to do with the adversities to some degree that women have had to face, the learnings that women have had along their journeys, and then lastly, to go back to something around empathy and humility, I go back to this moment in the Obama administration where the women, Obama's great, he's great, okay. He's all right. Right. Because what I'm about to say, I just want people to, not think I'm like against Obama. So during the Obama administration, the women were being overlooked. They weren't being heard. And so then what they did was they banded together and created a referential system. So sometimes if men are talking, they'll like talk and like the idea is, so a woman will say, oh, I love this water bottle, okay? And then 10 minutes later, a man will say, oh my God, this is the best water bottle. And then another man will say, Bob, that was such an insightful comment. Where did you get that comment about the water bottle? Okay. So this was happening kind of during the Obama administration. And so what the women did was they did a referential system so that if Mary said something, they would say, and then Bob would repeat it. Then they would say, oh, Mary, going back to what you said about the water bottle. Do you see what I'm saying? And so they did that. And so what I think we have to also do is think about systems where women come together to actually reference each other so that we can continue to uphold one another and also make men accountable and also part of the project. I work with a woman by the name of Shelley Zalis, talks about feminism, and men, boys also, and that's why this work with girls is so important, because it's about girls and boys.
Thank you. So Elaine, what's your reflections on
Yeah.
the same conversation, this piece, right? And how have you seen like women make a difference, and particularly women of color in your leadership? What's your thought? What are your thoughts?
So again, I think everything Lisa said is 120% true. That, you know, just in our lifetimes, women went from being regarded in a kind of more elevated way to now being disregarded and legislated against. And it's, I think of it in parallel to issues of equity around race too. Because, you know, similar trends happen with like racial equity as well. So it's, for me, I try and, you know, on the days when I want to be positive, I try and look at it as a positive thing because it's kind of the last gasps of colonialism, you know, and white supremacy culture trying to subvert the progress that we've made collectively as a society. So then, you know, I actually am not that positive a person, so those days aren't as common as they need to be. But, you know, I see it as fuel for the fight, right? To continue making the progress that we've earned and fought for, but now we're losing. So how do we keep the fight going, and how do we actually, you know, foment another large movement like the civil rights movement? What will it take for us to actually get to a point where we can fulfill the promise of this country for everyone, right? That's kind of like the broad, my broad vision that, you know, I don't think I'll ever reach. But anyhow, in terms of women of color in leadership, I want to talk a little bit about nonprofits specifically, because nonprofits are a huge part of our economy and a huge employment sector, and also has a large number of women working in the sector. And in many areas, particularly urban areas, lots of women of color working in low-paid jobs without a lot of progress. Until about the past, I would say, 8 to 10 years, when the older baby boomer generation started moving towards part-time work or semi-retirement, and opportunities opened up for the shift in leadership. You know, some call it like the silver tsunami, and there's been so many names for it over the past 20 years. And boards will be adamant about hiring a woman, in particular a woman of color, and the magic Black woman. And the research and the data has shown that women, particularly Black women, are not successful when they move into these positions, because the organizations and the boards are not ready to support them. And most typically, women of color are following a long-term white, typically white male leader, who has really put their stamp on the organization. And then the woman comes in and finds that they're taking over an organization that's in disarray, that is on the verge of collapse, with a board that is not supportive, and financials that are not going to support any workforce. So we call those turnaround organizations. So it's kind of sandbagging women, right? Because you're working in the sector, you have an opportunity to take leadership, and it seems like it's a great deal until you go in, and within 3 to 6 months, you're like, oh, shoot, like my reputation is now tied to this organization's success, and this organization does not look like it's going to be successful. So the average rate of a woman of color going into nonprofit leadership roles, CEOs, EDs, president roles, is 3 years. So typically within 3 years, most women, majority of women, I think it's like 55% of women, and this was in 2022, leave their positions. That's a horrible statistic. And it's a statistic that shows that women are being set up for failure, particularly women of color, almost always, actually, women of color. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to say that's exactly right in terms of the setup and the isolation, right, and the lack of sort of critical mass to actually for the what we talk about is the readiness of the organization, and also what we also see is the misapplication of certain kinds of tools. So one of the things that I've been saying, even about the people who've been examined, if someone were to take AI and go back to my master's thesis or my dissertation and review it, I don't know what they would find. Mm-hmm. Because I went to a library and I had a 286 computer. Does anybody remember what that was? Okay, so so that is what I wrote those things on, all right? And I went to the library, and there were some computers, but let me just say, it was not a Google search engine. Yeah. All right, there was like Alta Vista, maybe. Yeah. All right, do you see what I'm saying? And so, like, if you took Chat GPT and went over my dissertation or my master's thesis, it would be a mess, because that's better. I understand that now. Maybe I would use it, but those are unfair and unequally applied to women leaders in positions and then held to these higher standards, right? Which is very much about isolation, boards not supporting, and then this continual sort of putting women in positions where they will be attacked.
Yeah. No, that's so true. So my organization is a capacity builder organization. We work with nonprofits across the country. And because I'm a woman of color who followed a 35-year white leader in a national $90 million organization that was in turnaround that nobody realized until I was 6 months in. So I was in this situation. Fortunately, what made the difference for me is that my board also was it changed to predominantly women of color who were supportive. So I had a fully supportive board to move through the process. And having gone through it, I would never have taken my job if I knew. That's just a fact, right? Because nobody wants to be in that situation, especially when you're in a visible role as a woman of color. But lesson learned, and because we're a capacity builder, we started providing supports and programs for other nonprofits to help with their succession planning, to make sure that the organization is ready, to tell them if they're not ready, and to actively dissuade them from hiring a woman of color so that they can get ready for that leadership. And to then provide programming and supports, cohort programming for women of color leaders. So we actually have a program called ED of Color, and it was started during COVID specifically for women of color. And it's a peer support program as well as a skills and capacity building program. So back to the readiness factor, if the board isn't ready, what we can do as a society is actually help women be ready, right, and give them the tools and the access and the resources so that they have a peer group and that they can work through the issues if they choose to stay in these, sometimes just impossible jobs.
Thank you. And your point makes me think that, women of color, once again, or women in general, once again, have to come clean up.
Yep. Clean
in the house internally, clean externally. Someone else's mess. Right, and so how we see how the external gets reproduced, like one after the next, right? I am curious about this moment. You've all both alluded to it. I want to do a deeper dive and the backlash. Backlash of diversity, equity, and inclusion, backlash of both higher ed and also beyond in industry. We're starting to see some of it seep into nonprofit as well. The backlash of leaders of color, the backlash of women of color in leadership, and the backlash, especially in higher education, is a backlash against higher education as well. Mm-hmm. So those four sort of quadrants, which they are calling the squeeze, right? And so when you think about that squeeze, and we think about supporting women of color in leadership, and you think about courage, you talked about courage. What do leaders need to do now? What should organizations be doing now? What do we need now from our public? What do we need now from those who say they care to show up, to support the work, to support the people, or to be a facilitator to ensure the success? So I'm going to start with you, Elaine, first.
Okay. It's a lot of questions in that question.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I know, I'm sorry. This is my bad habit. I ask 5 questions in one, because I have many ideas I want to hear from the both of you, so.
I mean, my first thought was, I regret not bringing a pen.
I'll put it right here.
Thank you. So I think on my good days, right, I think what we need is just to keep going, right? We need to stay strong. We need to stay focused. We need to keep our eyes on the prize and keep fighting, regardless of particularly the legislation that's coming down. On my bad days, I feel what we need is revolution. There is, because it feels hopeless in some ways, even though we have the numbers. We all know, demographically, there are far many people who want to maintain and keep progress moving than there are people who want to hold back, right?
Yeah.
But we're not showing up. So what will help us show up? Maybe it's revolution. I don't know. It's beyond my pay grade. But there's a presidential election coming up, right? I think that will tell us a lot. And, we all need to get different citizenships. But I feel like particularly with the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action, I am an Asian woman, right? And I don't identify with the Asians who were behind the Edward Bloom, who were the face of Edward Bloom's movement, basically, right? Because I don't come from a privileged background. So, when that decision came down, the minute it came down, I was on the phone with foundations asking, what are we going to do? Particularly Asian leadership of large, wealthy foundations. People were frozen. It was a clear signal of change, right? You had affirmative action being struck down, and the domino effect was apparent from day one, and it happened soon thereafter, right? And we're in the midst of all of these smaller lawsuits now that's chipping away at the remaining tenets of the affirmative action bill. So what do we do? I think that's a really great question. I don't have an answer, because we can't, this is not something that individuals can change, right? We need to think of a collective action that we can all buy in on. And most importantly, we need to be cross-racial in that, because one of my big fears when the affirmative action ruling came out was that, once again, Asians will become the wedge for progress within communities of color. And just statistically, that's not true. There are far many more Asians who come from marginalized communities than there are the wealthy, highly educated Asians who come over on, engineering visas and then, already come from a higher class, right? They do not outnumber Asians who come from, working class or refugee communities. And as people of color and allies, white allies who support people of color, how do we come together collectively to really keep our progress going and to hold people accountable for their actions when they're working against themselves.
That accountability piece is an interesting point. We don't have time to dig into that right now in this moment, but I do know that more and more people are asking for greater accountability for leaders who say they're committed, institutions that say they're committed. What does that look like in action is the continuous question that you are raising as well. What do we need to do now, Lisa? What's your thought? What are your thoughts?
Because that's an easy question to answer. The first thing I'll say is about this idea of the gasp, the last gasp. So on my good days, I have that thought too. This is the last gasp of, right, a structure that's trying to hold on. On the bad days, what I see is South Africa and apartheid. And so I work a lot in South Africa. And so I understand that you can have a majority population, right, that believes one thing, and then have a minority population that rules that country for decades. And so as I think about the upcoming presidential elections, et cetera, I think we need cross-racial, cross-economic strata collaborations that we have never seen before. When I think about Trump and Obama, one of the things that they both did effectively was to build coalitions. Now, different coalitions, to be sure, but part of what they were able to do was to build coalitions. And I think we have to start to think about strategically, how do we build coalitions for those majorities, right? I was at Harvard when this debate and debacle began around affirmative action. And it was clear that exactly what you said, there was the face of who was representing sort of Asian America, and then the reality of what was happening behind the scenes. And you're exactly right? The majority of Asian Americans and Asians, first of all, are not economically enfranchised, but also weren't actually even supportive of the SCOTUS decision, right? And so I think that's where, when you see the writings in the New York Times or Politico or whatever, there are strategies that are happening and coalitions. So what are the other coalitions? And how do we begin to think about those coalitions? The attacks on higher education. I think the attacks on higher education, okay, I'm gonna say this. The cost of higher education is outrageous. Okay, boom, done. And we need to work on that. And there are all kinds of things around affordability, and I think governmental practices and partnerships and industry partnerships that need to happen around affordability. Okay, so that, I'm gonna put that bracket here. But the attacks on higher education more broadly are an attacks on intellectualism, are an attack on science, are attacks on those kinds of things. And that we need to be very concerned about. Because if what we're saying is research doesn't matter anymore, science doesn't matter anymore, none of those kinds of things matter anymore, that is very disconcerting. And I think that is where we are in many ways, right? And so I think we have to really, in our coalitions, remind ourselves that these things actually do matter. And again, to go back to the inputs, and that higher education, in partnership with community organizations, industry, government, is important. We feed research, right? We feed every industry, and not to lose sight of that. The attacks that we're seeing, and an alum of NYU, his name is Dan Schulman. Dan is the president of PayPal. You may have heard of it, PayPal. And PayPal, Dan Schulman did something during COVID where he looked at the bottom of his organization and discovered that there was inequitable pay. He then put $535 million, because when you're PayPal, you can do that, at the bottom level to create equitable pay for the people who were not being paid fairly, and particularly experiencing hardships during COVID, right? Some of those people we might think about essential workers who weren't able to go home, those kinds of things. Dan Schulman received hate mail, death threats. He is still under watch. Why? Because he did something that disrupted the normal culture of what, right, people, CEOs, are supposed to do. And so, and people held him accountable, right, in certain kinds of ways. I know Dan, and I've talked to him a lot. And so what Dan is trying to do is build a coalition of CEOs and other leaders who are thinking about how do we create equity? How do we deal with inequities? How do we build coalitions across sectors? And that's what I'm talking about in terms of thinking through, right? And how do we then double down on DEI? How do we partner with historical HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, HBCUs, indigenous colleges, right? Colleges that are serving Asian populations, particularly underrepresented in the West Coast, right? You think about all of that community college system that's been disrupted, right? All of those kinds of places. So how do we build more intentional partnerships? And I think that can help us deal with the attacks on higher education, build coalitions across sectors, and that last gasp to push against that gasp.
Thank you both. So there's one last question I'm going to ask before we go into Q&A. So those both who are joining us via Zoom and here in the room, please think about your questions, get your questions teed up for Elaine and for Lisa. So now this is a personal question, and this goes back to the question around courage. So I would love to hear from the two of you a time in which that you've had to be courageous in your career. Like whether it was in practice, whether it was like, and with a manager, with your team, with like, your community, to whatever extent you feel comfortable sharing, right? Because we are being recorded. But a time in which that you felt like you had to be courageous. What happened? How did you navigate that? And what did you learn, right? And you don't have to answer all three of those questions. I can already see your face, Elaine, like, why are you asking all those questions at once? But, because we only have a few moments for this response. But time in your career you felt you needed to be courageous, and what did that look like? And I'll let whomever wants to go first, because I can see both of you are thinking. Yeah.
I can go first.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine.
So it's my current job. When I took on my current job and took on a turnaround organization without knowing it was a turnaround, and having to share that with funders, with my board, with the federal government, because we receive federal grants, and also feeling like I couldn't do it. Because I decided when I became CEO, because I come from a growth mindset, that nobody was getting fired. Because typically when you come in, a board will offer you the opportunity to let go of leadership so you can bring in your own leadership. I decided to be clear and to let current leadership stay, but be clear about what they needed to do so that there was accountability. I was the first person of color in senior leadership in this organization, whose mission was to create a just and equitable society, and whose focus was racial equity, but I was the first non-white person. I'll just let that sit for a minute.
Still reflecting on it.
Yeah, it's still a trigger for me in some ways. And white leadership then, I was their boss, actively tried to dismantle everything I was trying to do, and also told me I was racist. This is coming from white leadership. It was precious. I think that was a really hard thing for me to take. I grew up in busing in Boston and thought, I understood racism. I lived through it. I, went to school with rocks being thrown at me. That this was my life. But I had never experienced that type of direct attack on my credibility as a person and as a leader by people who reported to me. So it was an upside down power dynamic that I have found out since. It's not unique to my experience. Many women of color stepping into CEO positions will also experience this type of undermining. Subtle and harmful. So lesson learned is that, I still believe in growth. I still believe that, people can shift their thinking with proper support and accountability, but I'm much more mindful about the ways that undermining and subversive behavior can impact the organization and also filter out to the larger diaspora of supporters. And holding people accountable, I think it's one of the biggest things that I took away from that. And being clear is being kind.
Being clear and holding people accountable is kindness. It absolutely is. I wondered if you had any thoughts later about keeping everyone on, but that's another conversation. That's another conversation. Lisa.
Elaine, I'll be calling you soon. So I'll tell a story from when I was young and then a little journey. So when I was young, I worked for an organization where there were a lot of MD PhDs. All my bosses were MD PhDs. I did not have a PhD yet. I had a BA, okay, just barely. Anyway, and so I was working for this organization, and I was receiving a lot of questioning of my capabilities, but also sexual harassment, just blatant sexual harassment. And so I decided that I was going to write a letter. I wrote the letter after someone for whom I worked. I worked as a researcher in this area. I told you before I had a kind of science background. I did demographic research. And I was standing at the front of the office, and this guy said to me, "Can you go get some coffee for me and my so-and-so?" Yeah, I heard the woo. And so I was like, okay, I'm being sexually harassed, I've now been asked to get coffee, and everything I've ever done is being undermined. And I was the only one who could run this particular database, by the way. So I went back to my office, which was a very small office, more like a cube, and I wrote a letter. And it was a 2-page letter, handwritten, single-spaced. And I folded the letter and took it to my then boss's desk, and I left the letter on the desk. And I went home, and I had a roommate, and I said to my roommate, we should go have some cocktails because I won't have a job tomorrow, so we should, spend the money today because I won't have it tomorrow. As it turns out, my boss did keep me on. We had, some serious conversations after that, but I would say that was my first moment. And I realized that I was a person who was not going to do that. And that proved to set me in a direction. And so then that direction was, then I had to think about something which I now call organizational readiness that I talked about before, but organizational cultures. And so now I say I worked for a giraffe, a bear, and a panther, as you know. And so understanding those cultures has then allowed me to figure out where to have courage, where to take risk, where to hold back sometimes. That's part of the journey. When I was at Tufts, I was directing a program in a center, and then I was elevated into one of these first diversity roles at the senior level, reporting to the president. And the provost at the time said to me, "You have crossed over to the dark side." I'll never forget him saying this to me. I was like, "The dark side?" And he was like, "Yes, you are no longer faculty only, blah, blah, blah. It's the dark side." And I was like, oh, God, what does that mean? And so now I'm about to become a president of a university. And after a 20-year stint of a president who is the white male president, 20 years, I'm stepping into this in September. I will become the president of that organization. And so so my last thing is to have the courage to do that, to call Elaine,
yes,
and to figure out what I'm doing, because I think that will be a very interesting journey for my next phase. But I think the courage was to make the decision to do it, and also to choose an institution that will surprise a lot of people, given my former journeys.
exactly.
Can we just take a minute to congratulate
Yes,
Lisa?
Yes. That black girl magic, there we have it. Yeah, I love it. So I will say this, when Lisa called and told me that she had gotten the role, I cried. Like, I literally cried. I'm gonna cry now. So I'm just so impressed and so impacted by your leadership. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you.
I can't say where it is yet. It's coming out on April 16th, but I will say it's right up my alley, and I think it'll be a great time. And I was actually talking to Shirley earlier about hiring people, and so I'm excited. Maybe I'll even, dip back where I was, Shirley. But I'm very excited about it, and I think it'll be you reach a point in your career, at least for me, where I'm at the end of my career. You may have guessed I'm not an alpha, and so I think it'll be a great way to give back and do some things that I've wanted to do. So yeah.
yes. And I mean, and Elaine, come on, you don't have a shabby job yourself.
I'm going to say, that's why I
$90
say,
million
I've got to call Elaine, okay? I've got to call Elaine. She's already done it, so I've got some phone calls to make, yes.
Anytime dinner. With
Well,
drinks.
yes. So let's ask some questions. I would love to hear some questions first from those here that are in the space, our Tisch colleagues. First, we'll start with you, maybe. Any questions or comments? Yes, Diane, please.
I'll start. It's my thing. The turnaround situation, there's a word for that. It's the glass cliff. And I saw this week that Boeing CEO is getting replaced by a woman, so there's been a bunch of articles. And Elaine, I think I heard you say if you knew, you might not have taken it. So I'm curious for both of you, either in retrospect or not, are there questions that people should ask when they're being considered that would be more insightful? Like, how do you make this decision, and how do you go into these positions with more eyes open, while also recognizing the mantle of representation?
Who wants to go first?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, you have to ask the hard questions. You have to get the financials. You have to do all those things that one would try to normally do during the course of one's investigation. I mean, sort of process. I also think, and this has to do with board cultivation, I think that, I'm going to tell a story about a presidency that I didn't take. So I was up for another presidency. This was about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, actually. And I was almost toward the end of the process. And the board there was a part of the board that was very progressive, but there was a very conservative part of the board. And so I said to the board chair, who was part of the progressive part of the board, I said, I need to meet with the conservatives. Right. Now, I didn't use that language, but I was like, I need to meet with the other part of this board and some of the alumni constituents. The meeting was put together, and it was on Zoom, because this was still at the end of COVID. And so they started asking me a series of questions. And one of the very old and very influential donors says through Zoom, after they were talking about a tradition, a day that they have, and the students have been protesting that tradition that day. So they asked me about what I would do, and it was a very ephemeral answer, like, yes, we'll work with the students, we'll work with the board, the answer you're supposed to give. And then one of the board members says, let's say the flower that represents the institution is a lily. I'm not going to say what the flower was, because that would give the school away. And so this donor says, and she has her glasses on, and she looks, and she says, well, you don't look like a lily. Oh. Maybe that's why you don't want to support the day. And in that moment, I decided I was not a lily. I was not going to be a lily. There were no lilies available. A lily, I love lilies, by the way. I'm a gardener, so I knew even the flower she was talking about. But I say that because that was a moment where if I had not met with that part of that board, if I hadn't done that kind of inquisitive query deep into the board, I wouldn't have known that. And when I say, I was up going to the campus for the visit. I was the last candidate. And so those are the kinds of things when I say, right, go to the other side, whatever those other sides are, to unearth whatever it is, that's the deep kind of work. And the financials and things are one thing, but another one where they told me that the president had read bedtime stories to the students every Friday night for 25 years. What? Yeah, that was another one.
No.
That was another one where I was like, I won't be doing that, right? And it came out during a conversation, right, where we were just talking about a school spirit. And I was like, Friday night, every Friday night? No. Yeah. So that you and I think those deep queries become really important, because that's where you'll get some of that information. And it's conversational, talking to people who are not on committees, visiting. One of the former presidents of Tufts, he actually did this. He visited as a parent and then talked to people. It's a great way to find out a lot of information. So things like that.
Yeah, no, I echo everything Lisa said, that it's, looking at financials and doing your due diligence, that's just part of the course, but it's actually having those off-the-record conversations with people who aren't the usual suspects. And that's when you actually get a sense of the culture, because it's the culture that will drive a turnaround too. It's not just the financials, it's not just what the organization does or whether the donors are happy. It's also the culture and whether the culture can support the change in leadership and help move through. Because you can raise money. You can always raise money. You can always repair relationships. You can always build your board. But changing the culture of the organization is something that's what takes resilience on the part of the person.
So we're going to take a question from the online question. Please go ahead, Ricky.
So this is a multi-part question because they must be friends with Monroe. So, what are some
My cousin.
what are some effective strategies in processing and responding to feedback as a leader? How do you deal with communicating what is or is not feasible in regards to acting on this feedback, especially given current resources? And then how do you get people to be part of the change they hope to see? And Elaine, just so you know, there's a pen next to you if you need it.
Thank you for this multi-part question. Yes.
So it's feedback. It's about how do you respond to that feedback when you maybe don't have the resources? And then how do you get people to engage to be a part of the change?
Yep.
Yeah.
I can start. Thank you for the pen. So I think one of the most effective ways to get feedback is to do a 360 and to do it throughout your organization. Your direct reports should get 360s. You should get 360s. And what you do with that feedback is part of your performance management system. Another way that I like to get feedback is I try and have one-on-ones we have 400 employees, and about 80 of them are in Boston in our primary location. So annually, I schedule 20 to 30 minutes with each staff, and it's their time to give me feedback on whether it's something performance related, something they have about the organization, about the work or the vision or the direction, but it's their time. And that gives you the ability to have a direct conversation and respond to feedback in the moment. And we also have a mechanism, we have all staff meetings, all hand meetings 4 times a year, and we collect questions. So you can collect questions and then respond to them in the all staff meeting. Questions that you don't respond to, you just make it clear through some other internal mechanism, like a newsletter, that, here are some questions, we can't answer them for whatever reason, right? Or they get delegated to other parts of the organization to answer, hopefully they're kind of departments. So that's a way of dealing with response and feedback. It's something that's evolving. I don't think there's like a set way to do it well. But there's many ways, and if your mindset is an inclusive leader mindset, you're going to respond to the feedback. You'll figure out what's best for the groups that you're working in. And then change, the last question, sorry, can you just repeat?
People who are interested in getting involved to make change. What can they do? How
should people get involved in change? Well, change requires everyone. That's kind of a non-answer to that question. One person can't make change. The entire entity, your ecosystem needs to support the change that you want to make. So I think the primary question behind the change question is how do you get people on board, right?
Yeah.
And how do you know if the right people are on board your bus? And how do you create a path for people to understand that it's the direction that you're going to? So, from my experience, I think that goes back to having inclusive leadership structures and building that from the ground up. Because if you don't have that to start with, you're not going to get people to buy into your change because they're the ones who have to implement and embed the change.
Thank you. Yeah, so about to be organizational, you have to think about how to do it collectively.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'll start with the change question and then
sure.
go back. I think that's exactly right. And of course, leaders and managers, and you have to float between those roles. And sometimes the urgency of being a manager and what you have to accomplish, and then the vision of being a leader, sometimes those things seem conflictual. But I think where they can meet is if you have vision and mission aligned, and then you think about the practitioners, right? That the practitioners aligning to the mission and vision, even if the practice is not the same. And I think about that because I work across schools. So my School of Global Public Health cannot work the same as my School of Tisch School of the Arts. You're a different Tisch. I have the Tisch School of Arts. And then I have the Stern Business School. Those business people aren't going to work like my artists at all. And so then I have to think about, right, how they're working across and managing change. So the practice of change, and in my case, the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion is different from my artists, because we've got to think about Broadway, we've got to think about all these other things, and then for my Stern Business School people or for my School of Public Health. So I try to think about change management that way. We have a mission and a vision, but then the practice is that has to align. I think then in terms of the other questions, then that relates to then how do people get involved? I think you have to lower the barriers. And lowering the barriers means in that practitioner space, making sure that people understand how to enter as practitioners. So we had a big a survey at NYU. I know I have to bring it up. Being at NYU, it was called Being at NYU, and I inherited this survey. You know how you come in and they've planned something and it's gonna involve thousands of people, and then they put your face on the picture and say, Lisa, now you're leading this. So that's kind of what happened. We collected data from 22,000 people, basically. But then the problem was, what am I gonna do with those data? So now we have the feedback, right? And we've promised the community, we're collecting your feedback. There were all these ads. Your voice will be heard. You will be heard. And I was like, okay, they've been heard, but what are we gonna do with it? So I woke up in the middle of the night when the best of my ideas come to me at 3 a.m. and I developed something called Being at NYU. And I took those, that information, we developed committees. And I'm going to talk about one other thing. We developed committees. They came up with themes, and we crystallized those into 12 major themes. And then what we did was prioritize those themes. Then what we did was develop what we called incubation groups around those themes. So that's so people could get involved, students, faculty, staff, and alumni. And then they could incubate new ideas. And what we said is, we will not build new buildings. You cannot have anything that costs over $5,000. So you're setting expectations. You see what I'm saying? So that goes back to prioritization and setting expectations. But give us new ideas. Ideas that we can actually, right, build on around, right, some of the themes that have come out of your feedback, right? Then we built a website, and we strategically communicated those themes. We strategically communicated the prioritization, and then we also, the programs that came out of that, right? So then we made the community consistently and constantly aware of what we were doing. It was one of the most successful efforts, and there were efforts that were built on this. We had a Stonewall initiative that followed this. We had a number of other initiatives that followed this kind of pattern of embedding, right, engagement, and then thinking about prioritization and strategic communication. And I'll end by saying that this one thing, which I think is really important, is that what you said about hiring and 360s and 101s is really, really important. And I also think, as a leader, making sure that you are communicating that to your team, but also to others who are in your network of leaders. Because sometimes other leaders aren't doing that, and so modeling that behavior is also really important.
Thank you. Those are wonderful and amazing points, and I love how comprehensive you both were in terms of giving some concrete examples and things you've tested before in your practice as well. So thank you for that. Other questions in the room? We'll go back to the room first. I have 2 questions. We'll go here and then here. And then we'll go back online.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'm thinking a lot about the feedback and kind of chuckling at Elaine's example of her kids being very, very comfortable providing her feedback. And so I think, and thinking also about working across multiple generations, in particular, and working with students. And one of the things that I feel like I've observed is that where I work, the students are very comfortable giving us feedback. And the reverse is not always true. And how do we, as educators and leaders, help develop that growth mindset and the resilience to also take the feedback as future leaders that they are going to be?
So my experience with young leaders often is the way they want feedback is often very different as well. And so what I've tried to do is multimodal feedback, right? So whether that's oral feedback, that's literal written feedback, right? Online feedback, all kinds of things. But the other thing that I've done is peer feedback. Because actually, as it turns out, in the Alpha and Gen Z and Millennial generations, they will listen to their peers. And there are some peers who are leaders, right, who are modeling some of those behaviors. And they often are not going to listen to me. And so I found that peer intervention can be very, very helpful and useful in those feedback loops. The other piece I would say is the second piece where I'll end, is intrapreneurship. So we talk a lot about entrepreneurship, but when I also am doing, when I even talked about that being at NYU and then the follow-up, is that part of what I tried to do was make sure that the younger generations felt like they had input, right? So that then when we were doing feedback, we could have feedback about what was successful and not successful, but they had put some of their input into it, right? So it wasn't just feedback about my ideas per se, right? And that allowed for more circuitous and interesting conversations.
Yeah, and I would just add the peer feedback piece, I think, is really important for the younger generations too, because they do have a lot. I mean, I think whenever we're in a peer group, we have, at that age, right, we respect our peers a lot too. And I would add supportive feedback loops too, so to ask questions like, well, what do you think? So that it elicits their response to a piece of feedback you may have given, and then have a conversation, like Lisa said, around that.
Thank you. Other question here, yeah. Jess.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. Elaine, you had mentioned earlier that during COVID, your organization had launched the ED something to help work with organizations to avoid the glass cliff situation. I'd be interested in hearing more about some of the metrics that you use to measure how to get organizations sort of ready for female leadership, particularly women of color.
So I will refer you to my Chief Program and Impact Officer, who handles all of the metrics for our cohort programming. But we do have extensive evaluation protocols for all of the things that we offer to ensure that we're meeting our outcomes, but also that there's value and learning for us, so that we can keep improving. Just some of the immediate learnings we have from that. It was also during COVID. It's the first year of COVID. So that program in particular, I approached several large foundations to fund it because in April of 2020, right after we shut down and it seemed like the world was on an economic cliff, what I was worried about was that these organizations, which are typically critical to their community and led by women of color, were going to fail because donors stopped giving, money stopped coming. Nobody really understood what the economic reality was going to be, and we're still waiting for the recession. That didn't happen. So the program was really set up to support these leaders to get through the crisis, but also to get their organization ready in case for the coming recession. And like in 2008, there was the huge recession, and it impacted nonprofits exponentially, particularly small ones. So our metrics were based on how well supported the leaders were, and we also provided them with organizational capacity consulting services, so they also had additional support in addition to the leadership support they were getting through the program. The results are primarily positive, but there are some learnings, some negative things that we could work on, predominantly that it was really hard to do virtually. It's really hard to do this type of supportive relationship-based coaching in a virtual environment, particularly during the first year when everything went virtual. So we've actually refined that curriculum. We're relaunching it this year with a different modality. We're going to do hybrid. And one of the most important findings for us was that the organizational capacity building work in conjunction with the active support for the EDs was actually what helped organizations stay solid and stay strong. It would have been hard to find the same success without one or the other, but it was a $500,000 program for 20 organizations, so chances of it being replicated are small to none. Because the investment that would require was just extraordinary and predominantly because of the intensity of the consulting engagements, the organizational management piece.
Well, that's a huge lift. Yeah, that sounds great, incredible. Lisa wanted to follow up as well.
I was just going to mention, there's a curriculum being developed at NYU with the Goldman program that's investing in entrepreneurial businesses, and it'll be online if you want to get more information about that.
Mm-hmm. So I have one last question as we wrap up for this frame of our conversation today. And this is a question about joy. What brings you joy in your leadership, in your work?
So I mentioned before I'm a gardener. I love to garden. It's one of the things I love to do the most in life. And so as a leader, that's what I hope I'm doing, is gardening, planting seeds, building, cultivating, and then, watching flowers and food and fruit, and then sustenance for people grow. So I hope that's what I'm doing.
Thank you, Lisa. Elaine,
That's a
joy.
really lovely analogy. I love that. So very similar again to Lisa. I mentioned earlier I started out in youth development, and fundamentally I love also to see people develop, to see people take opportunities, to see people surpass me, and to accomplish, all that they can and all that they want to. And, I find joy in being a cog in the larger wheel of progress for other people.
Yeah, so both clearly, again, demonstrative of what it means to be incredible women of color as leaders. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Lisa, for your contributions today. And for sharing your gifts with us here at Tufts as a part of our journey of creating a more inclusive workplace environment for all. Thank you for those that have joined us on Zoom today. Once again, we would love to see you this evening with our conversation with Raquel Willis, What It Takes to Bloom, 6 p.m. this evening. Please check out our website, the Office of Institutional Inclusive Excellence, and have an incredible rest of Women's History Month. Thank you again for joining us. Take good care.
Thank you. Best of luck to you all.
Thank you, everyone.